At the KDE Conference Academy back in 2024, this talk took place. Union, the future of styling in KDE. If you know anything about KDE, especially if you've been involved in designing themes, whether they be first party or third party, this is a problem that you probably deeply understand. KDE has a styling problem. This is not up for debate. Everyone involved in KDE knows there is a problem. Not a problem with there not being a styling framework. Not a problem with the frameworks that exist not being powerful enough. In fact, it's actually the complete opposite problem. There is a bunch of completely independent systems, which are all incredibly powerful, and somehow you need to make them all work together. So, Kate, Plasma, NeoChat, and Kclock. These are just 4 random examples. All of these look like KDE applications. All of these are styled in completely different frameworks. Why this mess came to be is a lot of KDE history, but basically it can be summed up with this XKCD. Pretty much, there were old systems that existed. People wanted to fix the problems with the old systems. They made a new system. Then they realized there are problems with the new system and made a new system. And then they made a new system. And now we have 70 different frameworks that are used to build KDE applications. Now, it's obviously not that bad, but this right here is already a problem. And everybody acknowledges that this is a problem. Frankly, I am surprised that with the way it is, things work as well as they do. Yes, KDE has this reputation of having inconsistent design. It could be way worse though, all things considered. And that right there is where Union comes in. Union isn't trying to be another standard in this space. It's not trying to replace the older systems. It is trying to be a thing that unifies the styling of the underlying systems. Those systems are still going to exist, you can still use them, but you can also build something that just does all of that stuff automatically in the background. So, about a year ago, this blog post was published by the speaker of that talk, moving KDE styling into the future. The problem is not new. If I remember, it came about sometime during the era of swapping from KDE 4 over to Plasma 5. I believe that's when SVG came along. I'm not entirely sure about some of the other systems. I think some of those were during the Plasma 5 era, but any KDE devs, let me know down below. Basically, it's been a problem for a while though. Unfortunately, it also is not easy to solve. It would be easier if they simply said, this is the way that we're doing styling now, but that is sort of antithetical to what KDE is trying to be. Some of the reasons it got to this state are simply inertia. Some things like Plasma's SVG styling were developed as a way to improve styling in an era where a lot of the technologies we currently use did not exist yet. The solutions developed in those days have now existed for a pretty long time, so we cannot suddenly drop them. Other reasons are more technical in nature, such as completely different rendering stacks. There are some sorts of design which are either easier or simply only possible in some of these frameworks. Those different rendering stacks are actually one of the core issues that makes this hard to solve. It means that we simply cannot use the same rendering code for everything, but have to come up with a tricky compatibility layer to make that work. This is what we currently do, and while it works, it means we need to maintain said compatibility layer. It also means we're not utilizing the rendering stack to its full potential. So by trying to make these things work together, it's basically holding everything back. This is a bit of a problem for regular use cases, but becomes especially so when you start looking at some of the weirder ideas out there. For example, the revival of Oxygen. Oxygen was made at a time where a lot of this tech did not yet exist, and people involved in design, notably people like Nuno Pinheiro, had some ideas that, in retrospect, were very difficult to implement, and especially more difficult as there is more tech involved here. Things like radial blur because you want to be difficult. Now, it looks good, and it is key to the Oxygen styling, but it does make things very complicated when going from multiple different rendering technologies. So how exactly do you make it work? With magic. I actually have no idea, and the fact that it does work at all, genuinely impressive. Honestly, incredibly impressive. I've talked a lot about the Oxygen styling, the arrival of Oxygen. It's not going to be for this video, that's a separate thing, but if you've not seen that, go check that stuff out. However, there is another option, which is to take a step back and realize that we actually may not even want to share the rendering code, given that they're quite different. Instead, we need a description of what the element should look like, and then we can have specific rendering code that implements how to render that in the best way for a certain technology stack. This idea is at the core of a project I called Union, which is a styling system intended to unify all approaches into a single unified styling engine that can support all the different technologies we use for styling our applications. And here we have a very basic graph explaining how it works. Now, behind the scenes, there is a lot more going on there, but this works well enough. Union consists of 3 parts. The input layer consists of plugins that can read and interpret some input file format containing a style description and turn it into a more abstract description of what to render. So this is the same input regardless of what the output is going to be. This is a shared format that everything can be styled with. How to do that is defined by the middle intermediate layer. This is kind of like your bytecode. If you're doing something like Java development, this is something between your source code and the assembly. It's this middle layer thing that can be turned into multiple other things. It is a library containing the description of the data model and a method of defining which elements to apply things to, and then finally, the output layer. This consists of plugins that use the data from the intermediate layer and turn it into actual rendering commands as needed for a specific rendering stacks. So Qt Quick, Qt Widget, SVG styling, Kirigami, and whatever else happens to be used with KDE into the future. Defining the input and defining the output, obviously annoying problems, but they're also relatively easy. The output is going to be existing technologies, the styling systems used by KDE. And to make things easier, the input's probably going to be an existing technology as well that developers in KDE are used to working with. Everything depends on the intermediate layer, what information is kept and what information is lost. And how do you create a system that allows you to easily convert between these different formats, but also still has the freedom to do the kind of styling that wants to be done in KDE. It needs to be both flexible enough to handle varying use cases, but at the same time, rigid enough that it becomes hard to intentionally or unintentionally create dependencies between the input and the output layers. This is why you have the middle point here. You don't want to have a system where you're just jumping between these points, and there are specific kinds of things in the input that only work in certain of the outputs. That's a mess. You don't want to deal with that. Yes, you can do it, but it needs to be done few and far between. You need to have an intermediate layer that actually does the intermediate layer thing. I've spoken with a number of KDE developers and KDE designers, and they all share these similar concerns, obviously from different perspectives. The designers want that power, and the developers are like, how do we do this in a way that is actually maintainable and allows us, if needed, to add in other outputs in the future? No one is really pushing back against this. It's more like pushing the bounds of what can be done, because obviously it needs to work for things like Breeze and Breeze Dark and then Ocean in the future and whatever mainline designs happen to come from KDE as well. But we also have this sort of styling and theming culture in KDE where it's expected that users are going to run weird and wacky themes, and nobody wants that to go away. That should be something that KDE supports into the future and can be done, and Union Union shouldn't be in a place where it is limiting that to the point where it feels like you can't do the things you want to do. There obviously has to be limitations, but anything you would reasonably want should be possible. Nobody wants these Windows 7, Windows 98, macOS, or even Oxygen themes to go away, let alone the just random one designer who's like, I want to do something weird. It's held together with hopes and dreams. They never plan to have anybody else using it. It is this weird, unique thing for their system. That should always be possible. To allow us to focus more on the core, we need to break things down into more manageable parts. We chose to focus on the intermediate layer first by using Plasma's SVG themes as an input format and Qt Quick style as an output. Obviously, outputs at the end are going to be everything that you want, but this part here, Plasma's SVG theme as an input, this actually recently changed, and we'll get to that in just a bit. This means we're working with an input format that we already know how to deal with. It also means we have a clear picture of what the output should look like, as it should ultimately just look how Plasma looks. So just a few days back, this blog post was published again by the same author, Union Spring 2026 Update, and things are getting very close to not being entirely done, but ready to at least play with. We plan to do a first release of Union with Plasma 6.7. I've not talked about this change happening, but 6.7 is an absolutely massive update. There is a lot of crazy things changing, a lot of really cool improvements. Frankly, it is looking like the best release in a very, very long time. One of the biggest changes that happened last year is that we switched the default input format from SVG, that is the Plasma SVG styling, to CSS. Somewhere during spring last year, I realized that while using Plasma's SVG served as well to get the initial data model sorted out, it was now holding things back. Additionally, and maybe even more importantly, it was not something that I felt comfortable with shipping and recommending people to build their styles with. Initially, Plasma's SVG styling seemed like pretty much everything they wanted. People already knew it, people had already worked with it, but the feedback from designers who worked with Plasma's SVG styling was the opposite. Getting everything right in the SVG for things to work correctly is a lot harder than it seems, with a number of quirks specific to Plasma that need to be considered, as well as limitations with regards to what features are supported. Additionally, there are several technical issues that made me uncomfortable relying too much on SVGs as an input format. And this is why it is incredibly important to do testing. Not only user testing, but if you're making development tools, development tool testing with people that have expertise in that space. You might, as an engineer, think, oh, this has everything we need, this makes sense, let's just go ahead with it. But if the designers hate it, if the designers aren't gonna use it, it doesn't matter how well engineered it is, it's not a good solution. And CSS actually was considered as an option by the author before they went with Plasma styling, so now we're sort of going back to what the author originally wanted to do. It is well known, has a fairly reasonable syntax, and is already being used for the task we want to use it for. However, then you have the matter of actually dealing with CSS, because, well, what uses CSS? Browsers? And a couple of GUI toolkits. There's not really a good general CSS parser outside of those options. There is the Rust CSS parser crate from the Servo project, which obviously comes from a browser. Unfortunately, this is Rust, and Union is a C++ project. Additionally, it's more about creating a parser toolkit rather than just being a parser itself. So I created CXS Rust parser library that makes use of the CSS parser crate and provides a C++ interface to parse the CSS files. Then I hooked up that as a new input format for Union to use, and we could start styling things with CSS. All of this is well and good, but you need to show that it works. You need to show that a theme, a style, can actually be built with this. So Breeze in CSS, Breeze built with Union. Also, there needs to be an initial default style, and Breeze is the style of KDE, it's the style of Plasma right now, so that needs to be done anyway. We wanted a known baseline to work against, similar to what we did with the Plasma SVG input in the first place. This does not mean Breeze will be the only style supported by Union, but rather it limits the scope of the initial work to what is needed for Breeze to work. If you wanted to try to support everything at the start, this wouldn't be done for a very, very long time, and if you happen to go down a wrong path, well, that's a lot of work, which is now absolute garbage. It's much better to get things out early, get things out tested, and then expand things from there. I mentioned it earlier, but you know how people say that KDE is inconsistent? That's not a joke. I don't know if people recognize why it's inconsistent, but here is a comparison of 4 different implementations of Breeze-styled buttons. All of these buttons are very subtly different. Some of them a lot more than others. All of these are Breeze, but they're not the same. And that's a problem. That right there is already an issue that needs to be dealt with. Some of these are intentional, such as the QQC2 Breeze style, using a different spinbox style from the Breeze widget style, others less so. To make it easy to compare what Union's implementation looked like compared to the other styles, I created a simple application that displays pages with controls side by side, each page using a different implementation of Breeze, and that's how you got this mess. Union's implementation of Breeze is not a one-to-one copy of the Qt widget's implementation as exposed by QQC2 desktop style, though it comes quite close. However, in certain cases we intentionally deviate either because the different implementations disagree on how to do something, or because Union allows things that we could not do before. The work on Union's Breeze implementation has progressed to the point where it is hard to distinguish whether or not you are running the Union version. We've also tested with a bunch of applications and made sure that any differences were fixed, so we are at a stage where we need to get Union into the hands of more people, both to get extra people testing whether there are any major issues, but also to have interested people creating new styles. Not just first-party KDE developers, but third-party people who just want to do cool things. Or maybe this is the first time you're getting involved in theming, and this has now made it considerably more approachable in KDE. But this initial release will not do everything. If you want to make a full KDE theme, you will still need to delve into the other tech stacks. So far, the focus has been on Qt quick output to have something that could ship in a good working state. With that work nearing completion, we can look forward to what to do next. We already have a prototype implementation of a Qt widget's output for Union. One of the next goals will be to flesh this out further into a complete Q-style implementation that is usable as the Qt quick output. Another item is styling Plasma. This is done with the Plasma SVG styling. The goal here is to also handle that. Now, like with the other things, it is not to drop the SVG styling, but we do hope to make it so that Union CSS-based styling becomes the primary way to style Plasma in the future. So possibly either a variant of Ocean or whatever possibly follows Ocean for like, Plasma rate long into the future. Whilst the goal isn't XKCD 927, in its current state, it kind of is like that because the only thing it is currently handling is the Qt quick stuff. Now, when it supports other things like Qt widgets, like Plasma styling, yes, it will move away from this, and that is in the works. But I understand the some of the criticism kind of calling it just, another way to style. Hopefully Union can actually change something here and can make the styling, at the very least, easier to make consistent. I'm sure there's going to be inconsistency issues forever, but at least a little bit better. Anyway, let me know your thoughts down below. Have you ever tried to make a KDE style and just realized how insanely complex it was? Maybe you're interested to see what Union can do. I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. If you really liked the video and you want to become go subscribe. And you want to become one of these amazing people over here. Check out the Patreon, subscribe, Daily Bearer Pay, link in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and hopefully the unification is soon.
Like this.